Alright guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the month of metal. It has been a couple days, but there is a good reason for that. Recently, I have been painting a Chaos Demon army for the old world, made up of all metal models. And I was painting this up for some games that I had. And I was originally going to do a video each day with a different unit, but I figured that would get kind of repetitive. You know, today we're painting this demon. Next day we're painting this demon. Day after that we're painting another demon. Day after that we're painting another demon. So I figured I would just combine them all into this one video, and it would also give me an opportunity to talk about some tips about army painting and how I think about army painting and the whole process. So this is, like I said, my Chaos Demon army for the old world. What I've painted for this video is about 1,500 points. I'm not quite certain yet on what I'm going to add to it to get to 2,000. But this is kind of the core of the army. It'll probably end up being some more Demonettes or some more Flesh Hounds or who knows. If you want to jump around and see specific models, they'll be labeled in the chapters in the, whatever that's called, the progress bar at the bottom of the video. And all the colors for each model will be at the beginning of those sections. So if you just want that kind of information, feel free to skip around. So while I'm going through this, there'll be some footage in the background of me painting all these models. They're not going to be, I'm not necessarily going to talk about each model while you see that model in the background. It'll just be going through the whole process of painting all of these different types of models. For me, there are really two kinds of army painting, and I have done both, although I sort of gravitate towards one these days. There's what I call paint as you go, and then sit down and do it. So paint as you go, I would say, is probably the most common form of army painting. And, that's your sort of default way people engage with the hobby. They maybe, to start off, they might buy like an army bundle or a spearhead box or something, or a combat patrol, maybe the codex, because they think they look cool. And then, they might play a couple games, low point games, think, hey, maybe I need some hard hitting units, or I need a faster unit, so they pick up another unit, and then they paint that, and then they play some more games, and they experiment, and maybe some things they bought never make it into their list, and they buy some other stuff. And, that they eventually just kind of work their way up to a fully painted army. And there are certainly pros and cons to this. The pros, or really the biggest thing, the benefit of this style is really just everything I just said. It allows you to be flexible, and you don't have to decide necessarily all at once what's going to be in your army. You can just kind of go through the hobby, and as you get excited about things, you can add them to the army. And if you're not excited about some things, you can just not put them in the army. And that's great. The cons, though, are it can be easy to get distracted. So if you're, say you're sitting at 750 points out of 2,000 painted, and a new shiny toy comes out from GW that isn't in this army, but man, that kit looks really cool. I'll pick that up and paint that. Well, that's fine. I mean, you're still engaging with the hobby, but remember, this video is aimed at we're painting an army, and so painting something for another army is not progressing you towards the goal of a fully painted army. Maybe that's not your goal, and that's fine, but in terms of painting an army, that would be one of the cons. The other thing is, it's kind of an abstract goal. I'm going to paint an army. There's no defined finish line. So, once I get to 2,000 points, I'll stop. But what does that mean? Does that mean I'm going to paint 5 tanks, 20 infantry, 10 cavalry? Who knows what that means ultimately. And so it can be harder to get to the goal when the goal is not defined. And then there is the other kind of army painting, and this is the one that I've been gravitating to more recently in my hobby. Probably the last 5 or 6 years, I would say. And that's the sit down and do it method. And that doesn't necessarily mean sit down in one sitting and paint an army, although many people do that. I have videos of that. I've painted an army in 24 hours. I've painted an army in 12 hours. That can be, I think that's great fun. Not to do all the time, but it can be quite fun every now and again. But that can just mean, maybe you spend a day, maybe you spend a week, a month, 6 months, whatever. But what that means is you're getting your, let's say, 2,000 points. That's the most common in Warhammer games. You get your 2,000 points, you put it in front of you, and this is what I'm going to paint. And I'm not going to paint anything else until this 2,000 points is done. So that, to me, is the sit down and do it method. There are, again, pros and cons to this type of army painting. The pros are it gives you a tightened focus, so it makes it harder to get distracted. At least in my personal experience, if I have a set of 2,000 points I need to paint and a new shiny thing comes out from GW, I'm less likely to go and get that and paint it, because I know this is what I'm in this box and I need to finish what's in this box before I move on to anything else. It also generally means that you end up with a finished product quicker than the paint as you go style. You've got your 2,000 points, you're ready to go. You don't need to do experimenting, play some games, toss some things out, add some things. So ultimately, you will end up with a fully painted army quicker than if you were doing it as you go. And then, kind of opposite to the other one, there's a specific goal. It has a defined finish line. So you know when this box no longer has unpainted miniatures in it, you're done. You can see the goal progress as you make progress. Whereas in the paint as you go, if you make a lot of progress one weekend and you paint 500 points or something, that conceptually that is roughly a quarter of your army. But if you're not really sure what the final 2,000 points is going to be, are the next 1,500 points you need to paint, is that 2 massive tanks and a named character for 3 models? Or is it 200 guardsmen? And so you can get an idea of how many points are painted, but because the per model count is so different across different games and different armies, you can't really get a handle on how much more you have to do. The biggest con, in my opinion, of this method is burnout. And that will obviously get easier and easier to happen the longer you take to do the sit down and do it method. And it's especially true for armies that have a very similar look between units. So for this demon army, I painted this over 4 days or 5 days. And as you can see, pretty much all the units look different. So burnout, for me, even if I took a long time with it, would probably not kick in because there's so many varied things that I'm doing in this army. If, for instance, you're painting Space Marines, I might get some hate for this, but a Space Marine looks like a Space Marine. Like, they all have different weapons and they do different things and blah, blah, blah. But they've all got the suit of armor, a gun, a sword, whatever. It can be very easy to burn out on, all right, today I'm painting another Space Marine, and then tomorrow I'm going to paint another Space Marine, and so on and so forth. So that, for me, is why the more homogenous the army looks, the less time I will spend on the sit down and do it method. So if you look back at my channel, I have videos on painting an army in a day. That was Space Marines. And painting an army in 12 hours. That was also Space Marines. I would not, personally, do the sit down and do it method for 6 months on a Space Marine army, because I know for sure I will burn out. And burning out is often worse than just being distracted by a new shiny. If you're doing the paint as you go and something cool comes out, you get distracted, you paint that thing, you probably will still go back to your army. But when you burn out on an army, it can be very hard to get back to painting that army. I don't really know the whole science of burnout, but for me, if I burn out on a project, it's very hard for me to get back onto doing that project. So then on to some specific tips for army painting. Something that I like to think about, and I'm sure I've heard this on other channels from other hobbyists before, but I can't remember specifically where I've heard it. But the idea about dessert versus vegetables when you're painting an army. So the vegetables might be the 40 Demonettes in my case that I have to paint, whereas the dessert might be the Keeper of Secrets. The Keeper of Secrets is going to be awesome. I'm gonna spend some time, gonna get this cool centerpiece model, and it's going to be a ton of points when I'm done, and it's going to be great. The 40 Demonettes, every time I finish a Demonette, what am I getting? 14 points out of the 2,000 that I need? And there's many of them, and it's repetitive over and over and over. You don't want to leave all your vegetables to the end of your army project. You want to kind of distribute them evenly. I know I've heard some people say you want to get all the boring stuff out of the way first. I don't personally like that. I think that can cause burnout also, and you never end up getting to your dessert. So I like to kind of intermix. So for me, I'll paint some of the boring stuff first. I always start with some boring stuff. Then I'll paint something like a centerpiece model or a cool character or maybe just a unit I'm really excited about. And then I'll go back and paint some more battle line or core or whatever it's going to be. And then just kind of flip back and forth. And I always, always, always leave the thing I'm most excited for until the end of the project. That way I know that when I get to the end, I'm going to be closest to burnout on the project, just by the nature of being almost done with the project. I'm going to be the most disinterested with the project. Not that I will be disinterested, but I will be as close to disinterested as I'm going to get. And so having the final cherry on top be the thing I'm most excited to paint will counteract a lot of that, at least for me. So, onto my army specifically. I did a couple things with this army that really helped with painting an army in general. For one, I varied the color schemes across all the units, I should say. And this is not really that novel of an idea in Chaos Demons specifically, because if you're familiar, or maybe if you're not, there are 4 god marks that you can put on Chaos Demons: Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch. And they all have pretty well-defined color schemes. And so if you're not doing a mono-god army, you can kind of automatically know that you're going to have different paint schemes. But I, for sure, wanted to make sure that I had at least some of the different marks. As it turns out, I ended up having all 4 in this army, so that was great. But that really helped break it up so I could alternate back and forth between, like, I did a Slaanesh unit, and then a Khorne unit, then a Tzeentch unit, and then a Nurgle unit, and, so on and so forth. One of the other things I did is that because of that varied color scheme, a lot of base schemes work really well when you have a unified theme for an army. For example, if you paint Raptors, the Space Marine chapter, they're kind of a camo green color, and you could put them on like some marsh bases that are like sort of brownish green, and they would look great on that. When you start getting into a lot of different colors on an army, you can start to clash with your basing scheme. Or what can be even worse is matching your basing scheme when you don't intend to. So for the Raptors, which is a Space Marine army I've painted in the past, their lore is that they change the color of their armor to match the environment they're in. And so matching their base scheme makes perfect sense. But in a Chaos Demon army, if you do, say, jungle bases, now your Khorne models are going to contrast really nicely with your bases, but your Nurgle models are going to blend in with those bases. And maybe that's what you want. Maybe it isn't. That, for me, it's not what I want. So I went with a basing scheme that would stand out no matter what mark I painted. And so that's why I went with this sort of yellowy desert color. There's no model in my army that has a predominant amount of yellow on it. And the desert is something that can be adapted later. If I don't like how the base looks, I can add some tufts or put some snow on it, or, I can really go anywhere from just kind of basic rocks and dirt. So let's get into the specific models I painted here. Just briefly, I'm not going to go through the full list of colors or anything. You'll see that at the beginning of each section. But just going to talk through some of what I did on each model and the decisions I made. So starting off here with these Furies, these are actually Harpy models, but I'm using them as Furies in my Chaos Demon army. They're cool, they're old, they're metal, so that's pretty much good enough to me. They've got wings, they're not holding weapons like Furies aren't holding weapons, so, this was kind of a perfect match for me. One of the things I did here was put a little bit of cork on the base, and that was to allow me to not cut the slots off the bases, or off the models rather, to glue them to the base. I basically just carved a little trench in the cork, and then put the slot down in that. it's probably not, it doesn't really matter, but for me, I don't like to cut those slots or those, I don't know what they're called. They're called slot bases, but whatever that bar at the bottom of the miniature is called, I don't like to cut those off because it has the information of what the model is on it, and the date it was made. And I really like that. I like the idea of someone getting these models someday and pulling them out and seeing, wow, these are from 1980 or whatever. So that's why some models are on cork and some models are not. But yeah, so for these Furies, I kind of cheated with them. I know that some units in my army, like Demonettes, for example, they can only be Slaanesh. They're Demonettes of Slaanesh. Furies, though, you can mark them with any god. I know mostly that I probably won't ever run them as Nurgle or Tzeentch. They just don't really fit that vibe for me. But I might run them as Slaanesh or Khorne. And so what I did here is I painted their skin kind of purpley, and I painted their wings red. And so that way, no matter what mark I put on them, I can be like, yeah, those are Furies of Slaanesh. They have pink skin, can't you see? Or, yeah, these are Furies of Khorne. They have red wings, can't you see? So that's just a little sneaky thing I did there so I can mark them either way. And then specifically, it's kind of hard to tell in the pictures, but I used blood for the blood god on the wings of these ladies, and that's just to be different, just to make their wings look like they're almost made of blood or something like that. So after the Harpies, I went on to the Keeper of Secrets, and this is pretty much the impetus for painting this army. I haven't ever painted one of these metal Keeper of Secrets before, and I think they just look awesome. So when I found this in a bag, I was like, wow, I have to paint a demon army now. And so I finally got to with this model. I just did this model in the generic scheme of Slaanesh in my army. So this kind of pinkish purplish skin, the red lobster claws, the bright blue highlights, simple leather, things like that. But this was probably, it wasn't my favorite model to paint. I saved that for the end, like I said, but this was definitely one of my favorite models to paint, and it was a good thing to put second to really get me into the project. So then I moved on to my one and only Tzeentch unit in the army, at least so far, and that's Flamers. I knew that I wanted to do some unit of each god. I wasn't sure about Tzeentch. I have some of the old bubblegum pink horrors, but them being pink horrors, they were going to look pretty similar to the Slaanesh stuff. So I really wanted to have something that was going to differentiate. And I didn't want to paint the bubblegum horrors like blue horrors. Just a personal preference thing. I really want to paint them like bubblegum. So that left me with Flamers. I had a bunch of these old metal ones laying around, so I went with that. One thing I probably should have said earlier is that on all these miniatures, I zenithalled them with the color of their god. So I sprayed these guys blue first. I think it's called Enchanted Blue from Krylon. And then I zenithalled them with matte Clamshell, also from Krylon. And then for the Khorne models, I did Mephiston Red and then Clamshell. For the Nurgle ones, I did Pale Sage and then Clamshell. And for the Slaanesh ones, I did I think Alien Purple is what it's called, from Vallejo, and then the Pale Clamshell. And that gives... So for these guys, I just did some basic washes, really, and then painted the teeth, and they're basically done. They kind of look like a swirling mass of nonsense anyway, so you don't have to be super detailed in their paint job. Then I moved on to the Flesh Hounds. These models, I believe, are actually Chaos Warhounds, but they're old, they're metal, they're cool, so today they are Flesh Hounds of Khorne. These guys were the simplest paint job that I had in this army. They're only 5 colors, as you saw on the what colors did I use for these miniatures. Just 2 tones of red, 2 tones for the horns and the teeth, and you're basically done. I really liked painting these guys. I painted these right at the end of the project, so I was kind of painting them at the same time as I was painting the last thing we'll talk about. And they were basically so easy that I could paint an entire Fleshhound in between steps of my last model. So then I, of course, painted a bunch of Demonettes for this army as well. I don't really feel the need to talk about them too much. I released a Demonette video last week or 2 weeks ago. If you want to check out how I painted them, you can check them out here. But, there's a bunch of Demonettes in the army. They look like Demonettes. Not really much else to say about them. So then finally we get to the unit I was most looking forward to paint, and that is this Nurgle Demon Prince. This is one of the two that I'm aware of older metal Demon Princes. The other one has the big tank of goo on his back and the triple barrel gun in his hand. Both of them are meant for 40k, I believe. This one, though, the armor is maybe not correct for the old world or Warhammer Fantasy, but I think it's enough. He's not holding a gun or anything, so I think he'll fit in just fine in my fantasy army. This guy, I used a lot of the normal techniques that I use on Nurgle, blending different washes together and getting kind of this weird damaged skin look. But I also did I tried to anyway, do some weathering on the metal. So I used some stippling of different colors on this metal trim and on his sword and the chains and stuff like that. And then at the end, I actually used some pigment powder, some orange pigment powder, and dotted that around him to kind of make it look like he's kind of rusty and, he's not, his armor's not doing so well. It's not maintained very well in the pits of Nurgle. But then I also wanted to make sure to have this big contrasting red element in the front of him here. So I did the cloth that he's wearing in that. And then I also like to mix in a decent amount of blue into Nurgle guys, just because I don't want them to get so... I think when you do just green and red, they contrast well, but you can start getting into the Death Guard aesthetic really quickly. And I think the addition of the blue kind of keeps them out of the Death Guard aesthetic just a little bit, at least. And not that there's anything wrong with the Death Guard aesthetic, it just doesn't really fit for Warhammer Fantasy or the Old World. And so mixing in that blue helps it be different from that. At least I think so. One of the other things I did on this guy, which is different than the others, is I used some technical paint. I used some Nurgle's Rot. I put it around his mouth. And then he has these weird smokestack things on his back. I put it coming out, bubbling out of those as well. So just a couple more in-depth things I did on this guy, because he was kind of the finish of the project and the thing I was most excited to paint. And with that, the army was done. Here are some videos and pictures of all the miniatures finished up. I was ultimately really happy with how this army came out. Obviously, there's more to add to it still, but the progress I was able to make over just a couple days I was quite happy with. I think the army is going to look great on the table. I'm not sure how many games I'm going to win. Demons are kind of in a rough spot right now in the old world, but that's okay. I'm going to love my time playing with them, even if the rules are mediocre. And that, I think, is ultimately one of the best parts about army painting, is that seeing your fully painted army on the board, knowing how much time and effort you put into it, really does help you enjoy a game, even if the rules are terrible, even if you're losing all the time. Just the joy of seeing a fully painted army that you did on the board is just really fun, at least in my opinion. Maybe not for other people, but for me, it is quite fulfilling. So, thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you tomorrow for the resumption of the Month of Metal daily videos.